Welcome to The Greg Bennett Show. I'm your host, Greg Bennett. In the episode today, I have a wonderful conversation with Dr. Tommy Wood. We discuss ancestral health, the benefits of stress, physiologic headroom, aka resilience, sleep and circadian rhythms, nutrition and social connections, and just so much more. Dr. Wood shares his thoughts on DNA and genetics, and you may get surprised at just where he thinks we're at with all of that. There's so much in this one. I really appreciate all his time. Now, some housekeeping before we go on. Please subscribe and review on Apple Podcasts. That would really help me out. Also, I love all your feedback on social media platforms, and I will get back to you on those. So you can go to Instagram, I'm The Greg Bennett Show, Twitter, just Greg Bennett Show. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn and Facebook, just as Greg Bennett. And I'll get back to you on any of those platforms and have a chat with you about the show. So please keep that feedback coming. Also, you can find all the show notes, the timestamps, any of the coupon codes to the sponsors, and the show links at bennettendurance.com/media. I hope you get as much out of this one as I did. It was just simply brilliant. Now, remember, success comes to those who endure just one moment longer. I'm so grateful for the continued support of the show from these incredible sponsors. You really do need to have these products in your life. Personally, I use each of them daily. Athletic Greens nutritional beverage, Hyperice recovery tools, and the glutathione supplement Continual G. What I love about Athletic Greens is its simplicity. It's delivered straight to your door and it takes seconds to mix with water. It tastes great and goes down easy. And I know I'm getting the most comprehensive nutritional beverage on the planet in one quick drink. If you're looking for one product that has as much high quality nutrients in it as possible, then you want to consider Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is more than just a multivitamin and multimineral. It takes it to the next level, adding a daily dose of superfoods, probiotics, greens blend, and more to support the gut health, energy, immunity, and stress. And right now, Athletic Greens is giving you, my audience, a special offer on top of their all-in-one formula. You'll receive 1 year supply of vitamin D and 5 travel packs for free with your first purchase for additional immune support. Many of the population are vitamin D deficient, including myself. I focus heavily in getting in the sun throughout the day, but when I can't, I religiously supplement with vitamin D. Adding vitamin D to your daily routine is just a great way to support vitamin D production. So if you're looking to get more out of your multivitamin and invest in your immunity, energy, and gut health, then you'll struggle to find anything more comprehensive than Athletic Greens. Take ownership of your health today and receive comprehensive nutritional insurance, a free year supply of vitamin D, and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase by visiting athleticgreens.com/Greg. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Greg. Now, you'll hear me mention Normatec and Hypervolt from Hyperice in several of the conversations with my guests in this show. Many of my guests and I are using these recovery tools religiously. You really must have them in your house. Sit in a pair of Normatec boots at the end of a long day. Use the Hypervolt percussion massage device to warm up muscles and loosen hot spots before working out, or anytime you have a niggling injury. They're just so easy and they're so quick, and they work. Their vibrating foam rollers, thermal technology, and Normatec compression systems just help you warm up faster, recover quicker, and simply move better. Seriously, these products are the perfect Christmas gift for any family member or good friend. Get $50 off all percussion devices now, no code needed, and get an additional 10% off with code GREG10 at hyperice.com. That's hyperice.com, HYPERICE.com, and use code GREG10 for 10% off. I have a web address for all of my listeners who already know that 1, the human body makes the most powerful antioxidants on earth. 2, the master antioxidant your body cells make is called glutathione, and the human body needs glutathione to live. 3, the reason I'm addressing a select group of listeners with this web address is that once you see what these scientists in my hometown Sydney have accomplished, it'll blow your mind. Go check out continualg.com, continualg.com. That's CONTINUALG.com. Check it out and let them know that I told you about it. All right, today's episode, I want to welcome back my go-to encyclopedia of knowledge, Dr. Tommy Wood. Now, if you missed episode 29 back in July when Dr. Wood was last on, I'd encourage you to go check it out. There were just so many great takeaways in that one. Now, a quick recap to Dr. Wood's background. He received his bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge, a medical degree from the University of Oxford, and a Ph.D. in physiology and neuroscience from the University of Oslo. And he's worked with the world's greatest athletes, from Formula One motorsport to the world's best endurance athletes. And he's currently on research faculty at the University of Washington in the Department of Pediatrics, with his research focusing on ways to increase resilience and the treatment of the developing brain. And his depth of knowledge and just ability to communicate detailed scientific literature to the rest of us is just truly outstanding and just very much appreciated. So welcome and thank you for joining me once again on the Greg Bennett Show. Dr. Tommy Wood, how are you, mate?
I'm great, thanks. Such a kind intro. Absolutely humbled to be here and be able to chat with you. And, you know, like we mentioned last time, we have both a friendship and a co-working relationship going back a few years now, and it's always so much fun to talk with you and work with you. So I'm really happy to be back.
Oh, I appreciate that, mate. And your episode in July was so well received. And just a flashback on that, you know, we discussed your paper on metabolic health and lifestyle medicine and how it should be the cornerstone of future pandemic preparedness. And, you know, we touched on many other things throughout that episode, but I felt like with you, we scratched the surface of all of your knowledge. And there was one thing that you said back in that episode, and that's why I really wanted you back on the show. You said, if I ever can't answer a question or I don't understand a question in biology, I try to come from an ancestral type of viewpoint. And what environment did we evolve from? And what I was hoping to do a little bit today is delve a little bit more into what ancestral health is and get a better idea of how we can use the past to optimize our future and our overall metabolic health within all of that. Now, you're a member of the Physicians for Ancestral Health. So firstly, what is that? And what are you and the rest of the team doing in that field?
So Physicians for Ancestral Health is a society that I was invited to join, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago now. It was right at the start of my Ph.D. And I gave a talk in the UK. And there was a physician there, Paulina Sayas, who works in the US, and she invited me to come across to a small gathering that we have every year to give a talk and be a member of the society. And it's a fairly small group, you know, depending on the year. We're anywhere from 20 to 50 physicians, and we basically are there to support one another in our pursuits. To promote the idea of ancestral health. And I guess, again, like 10 years ago, paleo was kind of really sexy and hot, and it isn't really anymore. And I certainly understand why it isn't, because there's a lot of sort of underlying components that people have various complaints about, and I certainly agree with many of them. But the core underlying principle is that, you know, we evolved through a certain set of, you know, environments, and those basically inform our physiology. There's something about the environment and the inputs and the day-to-day experiences that the body almost expects. And if it doesn't get that, then we see maladaptive responses that are often associated with disease. And if it does get them, then we see sort of beneficial adaptations that are associated with improved resilience is one way that we could talk about it. And those things essentially are tied to nutrition, sleep and circadian rhythms, movement, and sleep and social connection, and maybe, you know, some other kind of psychological and social stressors, particularly from a maladaptive standpoint, you know, because those things are much more common in the modern environment than they were before. And if you pull those levers, or, you know, you look at the commonest causes of death or chronic disease in modern westernized society, if you want to use that term, you know, either the absence or, you know, sort of misdirected application of those, you know, stresses or exposures are then the biggest risk factors for these diseases. So it's basically just the idea that there's an environment that we adapted to live in, and we've done pretty much everything that we can to try and remove those necessary exposures from our lives, because that sort of, I guess that's one of the downsides of having the cognitive capacities that humans do. And as a result, we now have to work really hard to try and reestablish these things in our environment to try and get some of the health benefits and maybe treat chronic disease. We mention ancestral health, but these principles are really popping up across a wide gamut of different societies and medical approaches. They certainly appear as the core principles of lifestyle medicine, integrative medicine, functional medicine, and I'm also a director and co-founder of the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. And they each have their own different approach, and they all like to complain about the other ones because of certain things that they do. But in reality, like, one of my beliefs is that the core parts of all of those things and the reasons why they're successful are essentially the same, and the rest is just kind of minutiae that often aren't really worth complaining about. So ancestral health is one way to call it. But certainly any of those are absolutely, these are the core foundations of those things as well.
It's hard to not look at it when we see all the media that we've had this year, in 2020, and it's been a lot of, obviously it's been COVID, and dealing with this virus, and some of it understandable, but some of it you can tell it's just for ratings or whatever else, and it's just this fear mongering. But it's very little have we heard about talking about lifestyle medicine, as you put it, or metabolic health. And yet, it's, if we look at it, if we kind of think of metabolic health as the basis of all that we need to stay healthy, and then once that goes astray, the alternative medicine, we could call it the Western medicine. You know what I mean? It's like once you need surgery, once you need pharmaceuticals, once you need vaccines and all of that, then it's maybe because we haven't taken care of our metabolic health. Do you see that kind of thing happening this year?
Yeah, I do, and it is slightly surprising to me. There are a few essentially firebrands out there who have been waving the metabolic health stick and the importance of that, and with good reason, because I think that is a core underlying, or maybe the core underlying risk factor. I mean, for COVID, but also for any other chronic disease you'd like to care to mention, as well as other respiratory diseases. It's the same, it was the same for SARS, it's the same for flu. These, having poor metabolic health basically leaves you at increased risk for pretty much anything that's likely to kill you, bar a very small, accidents, essentially. And so it's surprising to me that this hasn't come up more frequently, although, you do hear that, people who have pre-existing conditions is maybe what people have said, or pre-existing chronic conditions, and maybe they mention being overweight or obese, or maybe they mention type 2 diabetes, but none of it is really tied together in this overall picture of what I would call metabolic health, even though those things, body composition and blood sugar regulation are key components of metabolic syndrome, which is obviously sort of the way that we diagnose systemic metabolic disease, but that also exists on a spectrum, with the majority of people already on that spectrum, which is why so many people are at increased risk of these things. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't come to the forefront more. But equally, there's been a number of years, if not decades, of people talking about obesity and type 2 diabetes, and now dementia, which is the leading cause of death in the UK. And at some point in the US, it's basically predicted to bankrupt the healthcare system. And metabolic health or metabolic disease is a significant risk factor for age-related cognitive decline and dementia. We've been cognizant of these things for a long time, but we also, I think we know, I like to think that we know a lot of the lifestyle factors that feed into this, and they're obviously associated with diet and sleep and stress and movement. But there's been almost no public health sort of information process, or some of the both top-down and bottom-up approaches that we might need to help more disadvantaged populations who have less of the ability to manipulate their environment like you or I would. There just hasn't been any successful way to intervene on these things. So it then kind of makes sense why you wouldn't talk about it, because you haven't been able to do anything about it in the first place. And so I think that's where the big disconnect is that I think we know that these things are incredibly important, but every sort of attempt to get people to change these things or fix these things has failed. And that's probably because of another, we're focusing in the wrong place, or there's too many vested interests in the things that help us become obese and type 2 diabetic from a lobbying standpoint. So there's lots of different things at play. But it would have been nice to see this sort of coming to the forefront, because not only is it important for COVID, but it's important for heart disease, dementia, multiple cancers, pretty much anything that you might want to avoid for as long as possible if you want to stay healthy.
I mean, you touch on all that, but you know what I did the other day? I was very curious about, how long we live now compared to the past. And so I was like, okay, what was the last major event sort of about 100 years ago? And it was the Great Depression. And so I typed in, well, what was the average age that people lived to in 1928? So basically, 110 years ago. And the average age that people lived to was 57. Mm-hmm. So we're basically already outliving what we did by about 25 years, which is a huge amount. So you start to wonder, have people become very comfortable with modern medicine becoming the Band-Aid, the quick fix, that we can do anything we want to ourselves and it doesn't matter? Do you it's like we're doing nothing about metabolic health, but I think as a society, I feel like we're leaning on modern medicine now so much that it's kind of like, well, we shouldn't have to do anything because we're all living longer, and our life expectancy, in the late 70s, early 80s for Australia and the US and the UK, it's kind of like, well, why should we worry about anything? There's not that firework that we all need sometimes to make change.
Yeah, I think certainly there's been historically an over-reliance on what I would have called paternalistic medicine, which is, doctor knows best and you just let the doctor tell you what to do. And I think that era of medicine is essentially over, although some of the old guard in medicine and academia are clinging onto it, so desperate to do, sort of appeals to authority and all that kind of stuff, which is, experience is certainly important to an extent, but, we need to be much more humble in terms of what we really do know individually as well as collectively. But the thing that you point out quite nicely is that what the modern medical system was designed to do, it was actually very successful at. So if you think about average age and mortality rates 100 years ago, what people died of was infectious disease. And we are incredibly good at treating infectious disease now. And so the big improvement in long-term survival is because of antibiotics and improved intensive care. And we think forward into the 70s and 80s in the world of neonatal medicine, where I spend most of my time working. Now we can have kids born at 28 weeks of gestation, 3 months early, and there are ventilators and they can survive, and that never used to be the case. So there are lots of things that modern medicine has done and been able to do very successfully, with infectious disease being probably the best, and antibiotics being one of the biggest single contributors to that, so that you don't die of any kind of bacterial infection like you would have done 100 years ago. And so, however, that process involved a quick diagnosis and a single treatment, and then after that you were well and you could go home and you could continue. But there was no sort of chronic disease component to that, right? If you adequately treat an infection, you should recover fairly well, and then you go on your way. But that system wasn't designed to deal with this chronic burden of disease where there's no real end in sight. It's just continuous firefighting and symptom management, and maybe a little bit of treatment that can potentially extend your life depending on the condition. But the system that we have just wasn't designed to deal with that. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the breakdown, both in terms of the expectations of the people using it and the doctors within it. There's just it was good for what it was designed for and the way it used to work, but it just doesn't work like that anymore. Or at least the diseases that are most prevalent, can't be treated in that same way.
Yeah, we now have a new set of problems, right?
Exactly.
You say, okay, we're good. Oh, no, we're not. Damn it. I mean, that's the thing. It's one thing to live longer as a society, but it's also that quality of life that I think that we're now all thinking about. And I guess moving on that, you mentioned, when we talk about ancestral health or lifestyle medicine and things, when we talk about stress. Now, your field is, you're doing a lot of work on resilience of that we're stronger perhaps than what we think we are. Mm-hmm. You and I had a conversation a few weeks back about that, and that's what really today is a lot about. I want to really get your thoughts on resilience but I guess let's start with stress. And the benefits of stress, as you kind of put it, which I guess we're looking at there's chronic stress and then there's kind of that moderate stress. I don't know. You tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think as a species, we are the most adaptable and potentially resilient of any species on the planet. Given the environment, because we are we're so adaptable and we respond to stresses, with beneficial adaptations that help us survive. And I think the real key difference is probably it's maybe the type of stress, but then it's also the chronicity of it, how long you're exposed to it. So if I think about stresses that we could call beneficial or hormetic stresses, people may have heard of the process of hormesis, which is essentially a fancy word for what doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. The hormetic stresses are things like exercise, maybe cold or heat exposure, fasting, these things that just happen naturally as, sometimes there's no food available. And when there's no food available, then you have to go and walk or climb or run or jump to find it. And depending on where you live, sometimes it's hot and sometimes it's cold. And these things basically result in cellular stress, if for want of a better word, which then results in a more efficient, and more robust system that can then deal with these stresses in the future. And that's the exact part of any kind of progressive overload training program, which usually includes some periods of deload to allow for adaptation. And that basically applies to any multiple stresses that we might be exposed to. And actually, it even applies to certain environmental toxins and things like that. You expose somebody to a small dose, they can adapt to it, and then they get stronger over time. And there's obviously lots of sort of folklore stories of, Roman and Greek rulers who would dose themselves with small amounts of poison so that if somebody poisoned their meal, they would be able to adapt to it. And, those things, and those things, are possible as well. So it could even be things that you might think, oh, that's definitely bad for me, but you can adapt over time. And I'm not recommending that everybody, injects themselves with small doses of ricin or whatever, but that's how our physiology works, right? It adapts to these stresses over time and then becomes more resilient and robust. Now, if you compare that to the kind of stress that we find ourselves being exposed to in the modern environment, a lot of it is psychological or social. And so that can be, work pressure, financial pressure, family pressure, systemic oppression, which is something that we're talking about more and more, which is incredibly important and, has been prevalent in multiple countries that I have both lived and worked in. And these things, they essentially wear you down over time. Like there's no period that you have to be able to adapt and come back stronger. And so I would liken it to a training program that includes progressive overload, but never gives you a period of time to recover, deload. There's no off season, right? It's just continuous. It's continuous stress, such that you end up overtrained, if for want of a better word. And so these other stresses, they're quite novel stresses, right? I mean, 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, there probably wasn't much like continuous work, social pressure. There was no social media. There were none of these kinds of sort of cognitive social stresses that we're exposed to continuously. And there probably wasn't nearly as much sleep deprivation as well, being another one that we're continuously exposed to. So not only are some of these stresses quite novel to us, they also just happen continuously such that we never get a period to sort of recover and bounce back from them. So I think that's the real difference between the two, because obviously you can beat down your system with training or cold exposure or too much fasting or whatever. So you can turn those potentially beneficial acute stresses into negative chronic stresses. And so the dose and the timing is important as well.
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about stress, and I like how you bring it back to training loads and how we train as athletes. But I think it's also, we can look at that whether we're talking about our immune system, like you said, taking the poison or whatever else. I mean, it's fascinating to me to find where is that line, because as athletes, it's kind of, I think Joel Filio put it best in his. He said, I'm trying to find, and I'm going to get the quote wrong, but basically I'm looking for the most benefit for the minimal amount of work, right? And so we're trying to go, okay, what is the optimum area of getting benefit back from stress? Because if we think about it, stress training is just pure stress. We're trying to make ourselves stronger through hard work, and then we recover. And a good program has recover. And for myself, when we were training really hard, I'd end up jumping in the altitude tent, during the final push phase, and it was the final layer of really incredible stress that I put on my body, and forcing my body to try and overcome it so I'd be ready for a key race. But it's for Laura, we had to be really careful because she almost went into a hole many times by adding just that extra layer of stress. And I guess that's what each of us have to kind of step back and kind of go, okay, listen to myself. And that's kind of what I try to educate, people when I'm working with them, is saying taking ownership and responsibility for your own life and managing those stresses, and use some grounding tools or recovery tools to bring you back. I mean, when we talk about grounding, is that kind of in a direct correlation to the stress? Is it kind of like we're living in a parasympathetic state, and this is what we need to bring ourselves back to in a sympathetic state?
You mean sympathetic and bring us back to parasympathetic?
Pardon me.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, just in case anybody was.
No. Yes, please correct me.
Yeah. So yes, I think that's certainly a big part of it, and there's an increasing interest in the autonomic nervous system because it's which has two sides, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic being sort of the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic being rest and digest. These are sort of things that I learned in medical school back in the day, but still hold true. And it's sort of one of the main systems connecting the brain and body, essentially making them one. And you can use one to manipulate the other in both directions. So there are like breathing tools that you can do to potentially help balance. So you can consciously help balance the autonomic nervous system within the brain by doing certain breathing patterns. This is work of Andrew Huberman at Stanford, people may have heard of. And so there are ways that we can influence themselves, and this is why the autonomic nervous system is something that's so popular right now, because it seems to be something that we can actually both measure and intervene with. And measurements might include things like both resting heart rate or heart rate variability. Those are probably the ones that people have thought about the most, or published the most, certainly used extensively in athletes to measure sort of total load and predict the physiological load of a certain training session, because there seems to be some correlates there. So yeah, I think that's certainly one expression of what's happening here. And that chronic stress, chronically having to be alert and ready, and that kind of state of alertness is also driven by the way that we currently live our lives in front of a 2x4-inch screen that we're continuously focused on, which actually drives that sort of heightened state of awareness, and that has its own negative side effects. But that seems to be where we're spending most of our time, which is potentially potentiating some of that stuff as well. So yeah, the autonomic nervous system is a nice way to sort of look into what might be going on there.
I know it's like we never get to. I mean, I've always looked at stress as almost an anxiety to somewhat. If you have a direction, a passion, a goal to fuel, it's great fuel for where you want to go. But I almost feel like we can't turn it off now. It's like we're fueled and anxious and ready to go, but it's kind of like, but I'm not getting my downtime. I'm not getting that ability. And now we're all having to, a lot of these episodes that I've had, I talk about mindfulness and trying to, how do we get ourselves to take a break? And for any parents out there, I feel like it is now just 24/7. You're just on. And it's kind of like, okay, we actually got to work at trying to bring ourselves back to some kind of neutral. And on that, I guess, let's move on to resilience, because I think your whole thing is that we're far more resilient than what, maybe the media or whoever portraying us to be. That, it's one of those things. I think this past year with COVID, it was kind of, I think the fear that came out, we all thought, okay, this is the end of time. It was like, okay, this is the end. And then it's almost like going, okay, no, we can handle this. Now, it's not perfect by any means. It hasn't been great. And I know there's a lot of people struggling out there, and lots of families that aren't together and people losing jobs. I'm not saying that by any means, but it does seem that as a human race, we are far stronger. So let's move on to resilience, and tell me, where have your studies, taken you and on the human spirit, I guess that we call it.
Yeah. So I like to think of resilience, or in another way, as physiologic headroom. And so resilience can be thought of as, just this cognitive or psychological ability to bounce back. And that's certainly one way that people talk about resilience. But I like to think of it more broadly. And physiologic headroom is a phrase that I learned from Art Devaney, who is this awesome, old school, rather ancestral health kind of guy. He's now in his 80s. He's an economist. He was a minor league baseball player. He was around at like sort of the dawn of original bodybuilding, and he's a super smart guy. Still very active. And he talks about physiologic headroom, which is essentially the difference between what you need to do from day to day versus what is your maximal capacity. So it's the difference between say me sitting down, and this is important as we get older and want to not fall and break a hip and die of pneumonia in hospital. There's the difference between me sitting down onto the toilet, being able to do a bodyweight squat, versus what's my maximal back squat. Like, what's the delta there? What's the size of that? And obviously, you get to a point of diminishing returns, but you want to have some buffer between what you are physically capable of and what you have to do from day to day. And so that obviously makes sense from a physical performance standpoint, right? If your day to day is just walking up and down stairs, and you can do a 9-hour Ironman, right? Your physiologic headroom from a physical capacity is quite significant. But it also applies to, the immune system, inflammation, oxidative stress, psychological stresses. And what sort of I think we know about humans, again, is that if they're exposed to these stresses, and there's overlap, right? So if you're exposed to if fasting is the stress that you're exposed to, that's probably also going to improve your resilience to other things. So because they all seem to intersect at a number of pathways around the function of the mitochondria. So these things overlap. But if we have some exposure to these, we've adapted and we're stronger, then we have a greater ability to handle a greater load when it shows up. And so I think we know that about ourselves. Again, it's what makes us very adaptable and resilient, to use that word, as a species. But there are a number of potential problems that I think are diminishing that. So one is essentially the fact that we've removed movement and hot and cold and, the absence of calories occasionally from our environment. Like that, just, for everybody listening to this, that those things never have to be a factor in your life if you don't want them to be. And so we just don't have that adaptation built into the system because we're not exposed to those things. And, with that comes the increased, disease risk. And, as you become, metabolically disordered or diseased, then you get immunological disorders as well, which are then associated with worse outcomes, say after something like COVID. But then it's also going to be associated with poorer mental health and poorer mental and cognitive resilience. So all of it is linked together. So that's one part of it, and that's kind of happening on a population level. At the same time, I also worry about the language that we use in the world of health optimization. And so you've talked about genetics on your podcast, and that's one of the areas where I think that is the worst offenders with this, which is that you are either normal, which is usually quite rare, or you have some deficiency or malfunction. So the language is always of bad
pass or fail.
No, but it's not even that. It's not even like pass or fail. It's just normal or fail, right? So like
normal or fail.
There's no benefit that you get from the good side, or having a normally functioning or 100% function or whatever the gene is. So like we constantly talk about things from the negative side, and there's plenty of data to suggest that if I talk about negative risk factors for you and your physiology, like genetics being probably the one that's easiest to define and therefore has been most widely researched. If I tell you you're at risk of a disease, or if I tell you you're at risk of worse athletic performance, you will have worse physiology. You will perform worse, right? And so this is the problem. Then we can expand that to continuously trying to optimize or improve things. So say you wear some kind of sleep tracker, and like there's this continuous pursuit of perfect sleep, which you are never going to reach. And then when you're the majority of people, as you're going to sleep, you'll think, am I going to have a good night's sleep? I hope I have a good night's sleep, because then my sleep tracker will tell me that I slept well. But oh no, what if I don't sleep well? Then the sleep tracker is going to tell me that I didn't sleep well, and now I'm not sleeping because I'm worried about what the sleep tracker is going to tell me about my sleep.
I got to jump in there. I'm the worst for any of those sleep trackers because I struggle with anxiety at the best of times. So now if I have a test or a measurement, now I certainly don't sleep well.
So there are some people who are very objective and analytical, but my guess is it's less than 1% of the population who can just look at this data objectively and say, oh, this is what happened yesterday. This is why I didn't sleep as well.
My wife is that 1%. Yeah, but I'm not. No,
and so for the majority of people, but this is the language that we use, and it could be the same for blood sugar, it could be the same for sleep.
Yeah.
It's definitely the case for genetics. Like you have 50% function in this gene, or this gene isn't working properly, or and that immediately makes you think like you are deficient. And that is reflected in your physiological responses. That's been shown. So the problem is that we approach these things, we approach the improvement in health from a negative standpoint. And so there's this continuous negative language that does have a negative effect on our physiology. And so we're continuously telling people, you are not as good as you could be. And that doesn't make people think, oh, well, I hope I can be better. It makes them feel bad about themselves, which has a negative effect on them. So there's this continuous language, even in the world of health improvement, health optimization. There's this negative language that's telling people that they are not as good or as strong or as resilient as they could be or they can be. And that's just completely false. So I think there's a danger of kind of creating these cognitive processes in the pursuit of optimization. So at both ends of the spectrum, one, just like on the population level, the worsening physiological metabolic health in general has kind of sort of put most people in this bad place in terms of their own resilience. And then at the other side, we're kind of, by overanalyzing things and people who want to care about their health, there's also the potential to have a negative effect on our resilience there, because we're telling ourselves that we're not as strong or not as resilient as we can be just because of the language that exists.
So let me quickly sorry to jump in there, but how would you approach the language? And is it kind of saying, look, you're awesome, how do we stay there mindset? Is it
Yeah.
like you are the most amazing human on, but how do you keep there and how do you not fall back? So it's kind of coming from the other side, or do you just approach it from a neutral, just try and get people to neutral and be comfortable with who they are? And because I think we're all trying to feel better and look to feel better in the future. I know I've said on this show a few times, I'm always thinking about longevity and maintaining strength and, being able to play with the kids in 10 years' time, when I'll be almost 60. It's that kind of mindset. So how do we approach it? What kind of language do we use?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first point is not to overstate the effect of any one thing. So the vast majority of single mutations in your genes mean absolutely nothing. Like they are overinterpreted. They're essentially nonsense. As a one by one, game of whack-a-mole, which is essentially what's done. There's just no evidence to support that. So the first thing that we can do is not overanalyze or overinterpret sparse or incomplete data on any one given thing. And then the next thing that I think is important is just worth, remembering that as a member of the human species, you have enormous capacity for both well-being and performance. And the things that are always important are always going to continue to be important. They're the things that we talked about to do with sleep and stress and movement and nutrition. And once those things, there's always going to be some room for improvement. But I think, and equally, there isn't that much space for positive thinking because that doesn't really do much either. Positive psychology has a number of potential downsides, including reducing our ability to achieve a certain goal because we kind of trick ourselves into feeling like we already achieved it and then we never go out and get it. So there's definitely there's downsides to that as well, and we can't ever really change our thoughts. Interestingly, you have no real control over that, but you do have control over whether you sort of latch onto negative thoughts and ruminate on them, and that can be sort of again, you can think about breathing techniques, going outside, walking in nature, just sort of changing our environment, and then affects whether we sort of ruminate and get in some of these negative thought processes. So there's no sort of single right answer. I think it's not just everybody should be positive thinking and telling themselves they're wonderful, because again, there's no real evidence to support that either. But I think
it's not sustainable.
No,
it's
exactly.
Not sustainable. Yeah. It's exhausting trying to be positive and happy. I'm not an advocate for trying to be happy all the time, nor positive. I'm a real advocate for just turning down the noise and try and find neutral. Then happiness can come in every now and then. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Of course, and you're going to be sad, you're going to be angry, you're going to be happy. This is fighting those things probably it comes with its own downsides, but essentially realism and acceptance are the most important things. And the main thing that I would advocate for is just not introducing this language of negativity around something that there isn't really that much evidence to support. And people do it in a well-meaning manner, right? They make these sleep trackers because maybe they want you to sleep better, and they run these genetic tests because they want to help people, solve complex health problems. And so I'm not saying that anybody is coming from this, with like a nefarious goal. That it's well-meaning, but I think it introduces more problems than it solves, particularly around the language usage. So I would just always bring it back to those kinds of basics, and then build from there.
It's interesting, isn't it? Even if you just look again from the sporting side and the endurance of sport, we've seen athletes in the past that race to heart rate, no matter what. They're data people. And I've always been a big advocate of utilizing some of that data to know where you are, but to race and you're a different person on race day, and you have a taper and you're rested and you're different than all your training days, and to race to the heart rates that you have prescribed yourself in training, you could miss out on an incredible performance. It can almost be a limiter as much as it can be something that makes you feel like you'll never get there. It's kind of I feel like sometimes we're missing just living. Do you know what I mean? It's like everything is so data driven now, and we got to fit, I need my 8 hours sleep. It must be 8 hours. And I said, well, hang on. Maybe you're someone that works better on 6 to 7 hours sleep and a nap later in the day or whatever. I mean, and that is always curious to me, is to understanding that we're all very different. And again, it comes back to this ancestral health. And I had a Dr. Ara Sapaya on, a fascinating story in his own right, and a really wonderful listen. But we were discussing briefly nutrition, and he said, look, Greg, I'm from India and Malaysia. And he said, my ancestors have all been always on the equator, very hot environment, and we're kind of used to more carbohydrates in this kind of environment. But if you come from the Scandinavian, and I think you've got, what do you have? What's your bloodline? You've got your dad's side.
Yeah, so like a bit of Anglo-Saxon, but largely, Northern European, certainly Scandinavian.
And so maybe perhaps you're used to eating more fats. Do you think there's something to what he was saying there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think this will probably become less relevant over time as we become more mixed in terms of our ancestries. But I think the best that we can do currently, if we're trying to, there's obviously a data-driven approach in terms of optimizing nutrition, and you can measure particularly glucose responses are a nice way to kind of track that, how you respond to certain foods. And so you can do that if that's something that you're interested in. But equally, I think, from a first principles approach, the best way to, quote unquote, personalize nutrition is to think about, where did your ancestors come from? What kind of diet were they eating? And that's probably going to be, going to be closer to something that's better for you personally. And there's, there's very nice data looking at percent of carbohydrate in the diet based on latitude. And so, if your nearest ancestors live near the equator, absolutely, I think you are more likely to do well on a higher carbohydrate diet. And if you're, I've made this joke a couple of times previously, whereas, if you're in northern Norway or Iceland, where my ancestors come from, if you want to try and find a starchy carbohydrate, you're going to be out of luck.
You guys have just got to eat seal fat or whatever. What is it you go up there?
Lots of fishing, maybe some deer and elk. But it's largely going to be animal based, and your carbs are going to come from a few like slightly ropey looking berries in the summer. That's it. So I think that plays a big role, and there's also similarly some data that supports the same thing, but both from a type of fat standpoint. So people who, again, from that central or close to the equator, they actually started sort of like when they started to farm and relied more on plants versus animal foods. Those things happened at slightly different times. So if you were in an area where you're more likely to get more plant-based foods, so then that's going to be more carbohydrates in your diet, then you do better with things like plant-based omega-3s, alpha-linolenic acid, which is a precursor for the longer chain omega-3s, DHA and EPA. And so you may do better with those forms because that's what you adapted to. Whereas if you're somebody like me and you were eating a lot of marine life, seafood, right, then I do less well. I'm less likely to be able to convert those plant-based omega-3s into the longer chain ones, and I'm going to need to get those directly from the diet. And again, so it's not perfect, but those patterns do certainly seem to appear. And if you're going to start with trying to personalize a diet a little bit, then thinking about 1,000 years ago, what were my ancestors likely to be eating? That's certainly going to be a good place to start.
A quick mini break. I really want to encourage you to do something special for yourself and sign up to Athletic Greens and get a free year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase by visiting athleticgreens.com/Greg. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Greg. Laura and I were discussing over breakfast this morning the environment that you're in and the foods and things like we're discussing that grow in that environment. But then I threw in the fact, look, we're down in South Florida here, and of course, coconuts and seafood or whatever it is. But I'm like, well, hang on. it probably doesn't work for us in the same way as it did 100 years ago because we live in air conditioning. So what we need from a coconut, in terms of the minerals or whatever and the drinking and everything else is because we were meant to be dehydrated, sweating and in a real heap. But we're never in that state. So we actually don't need to eat, so we are different to what we're not really in the environments that we think we are because we're all living so comfortably these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's kind of like we can't just live off that side of thing. Now, you also mentioned, like, I just want to touch a bit more on it. I kind of got sidetracked there. We went to nutrition but the DNA and the genetics, and I have spoken a little bit about it, and I'm excited about the future of it. But I have also said, look, I think they're only really scratching the surface on all of this, and there's still a long, long, long way to go. And it was when I had Dr. Mansoor Mohammed come on, and he read my DNA, my genetics on the episode, and I was a little bit like, oh, I'm putting myself out there. It's a little bit vulnerable, but he came in and he said, Greg, I've tested many of the best endurance Red Bull athletes and yourself. And he said, what you all have in common, he said, you all produce your natural levels of glutathione. We're all very, very good. He said, okay, you're all in the top 1% of that. But he said, I had a list of things that I thought you all would have, just as an interest. And he said, none of you are good at methylation. And he said he couldn't believe that some of the world's best endurance athletes were really poor at that. And he couldn't figure out why. And so sort of going on what you were saying in terms of, if I walked away and only got that information back, I'd be like, oh, I'm never going to recover from an injury. I don't deal with inflammatory response well. But he's still trying to go, well, maybe having high levels of glutathione or whatever it is, antioxidant, is helping with that in some other way. And so my point with all of that is going, we get little snippets, tiny little snippets of our DNA. And if we lean too heavily on one of them, I think that can affect us psychologically for others. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Did you still think there's something like he mentioned with my vitamin D that, I don't receive it, I don't transport, and I don't receive it into the cells very well. And vitamin D has obviously been a big topic of conversation in this last 12 months, since Rhonda Patrick kind of came out and said, we all got to be taking vitamin D to reduce the effects of COVID. Mm-hmm. And he said, I don't. So I've kind of been supplementing a bit more with vitamin D. What do you think in terms of coming from a DNA study saying I don't do very well with vitamin D? Do you think that's right?
So immediately, I'd like to re-highlight the point that I made about language.
Yeah.
You don't methylate. You don't methylate well. You don't use vitamin D well, right?
Yeah.
There's this negative language that.
But if I can replace it, though, it's not negative. If I can get myself to neutral through supplements, is it just?
Well, so there's a point before that, right? So when you actually look at an individual SNP or group of SNPs that are associated with a certain outcome, and that could be a glutathione level, it could be your vitamin D level, it could be your vitamin D signaling, which is probably what's more important. It could be, when you're talking about you don't methylate well, it doesn't mean anything. Like, which methyl groups and where, and how are you measuring them? And when you look at a certain SNP, and then you look at the phenotype, the outcome, which is what you care about, what people talk about is the average effect. On average, you have 50% less glutathione or 50% methyl groups on whatever. But the variability is huge. It's huge. And so when you look at the actual data that explores this, most individual SNPs, even if like the average effect is a 50% difference, only about 10% of people will have a phenotype which is not seen in those with the different genotype or the better genotype. So the variability is so massive that you could have a SNP that's associated with better glutathione, but you could be in the bottom half of the normal distribution, of which there would have to be a normal distribution because that's how these things work. And then actually your glutathione level is no different from somebody who has the bad SNP, right? And that just happens in normal variability. So unless you're directly measuring it, I don't think those statements are particularly useful. So unless you are measuring your vitamin D level, which you should, and you're supplementing, which you probably should, and you're looking at looking at a marker of vitamin D signaling, the easiest you can probably get is parathyroid hormone, although there are others like FGF21. Unless you are physically measuring how you're responding to a certain thing, I think making those statements about your genetics is a complete waste of time. I don't think it's scientific. I think it's telling you that your body isn't physiologically capable, which it should be. So when you're talking about people who don't methylate properly, so you might be talking about your MTHFR gene. 85% of people, slightly more, have an MTHFR gene which doesn't methylate properly, as in it methylates less efficiently than the 100% of the 14% of people. And so that's most people. So going around telling most people they don't methylate properly, this is normal variability. It's associated with perfectly normal health and health outcomes. But to tell them that they have this negative like anchor in their physiology is just so unnecessary, and it's not true. So I get kind of worked up about this stuff.
It's good. I want to get worked up. Tell me how it is.
I care about your health and performance, Greg. And yes, vitamin D is incredibly important. I think it's incredibly important for multiple things, including potentially risk of severe, poor outcomes if you are exposed to COVID or multiple other things. So you should measure your vitamin D. If it's below 40, you should supplement. And if you're in the gray area, or you're not sure whether your signaling is good, right, because the absolute level doesn't tell you how well it's signaling, then measure your parathyroid hormone. It should be in the bottom half of the normal range. And if it is, then your signaling is good, and you don't have to worry about your SNPs whatsoever. So there's hard data that you can use to answer these questions. And I think the rest of the time we're just sort of like shooting in the dark and then telling people stuff about themselves that I don't think is necessarily true.
But what about when we talk about measuring our level of vitamin D, and at the same time we say, when we measure these things, it's a real snapshot in a moment of time. Like I could have measure my vitamin D after being inside for 4 days, and it been no vitamin D from getting outside, and then I'm in the sun for the next 5 days, and so it's kind of like these snapshots. So do you get measured like all the time, or is it having a really good understanding of when you do get measured, knowing that you've been inside for 4 days, that you should expect a low vitamin D?
So vitamin D particularly doesn't fluctuate within days as much like that, right? It's a fat soluble hormone. There's some buffer in there, but it is a good question. And so the most important thing is that if it's something that's directly affecting your health and performance right now, and you're doing something to change it, then you should repeat it. So if you are, you find yourself to be low in vitamin D, and you're probably going to need a high dose to replace that. If you're taking high doses of vitamin D, you should probably retest your vitamin D and make sure, A, that you've got into the range that you want, and B, you sort of like haven't overdone it. So, and vitamin D is obviously...
I would never do that.
And vitamin D is an important one because the fat-soluble vitamins, you have a little bit less, you're much more likely to overdose if you take massive doses for long periods of time compared to some of the water-soluble vitamins. So, I think if you're directly intervening and wanting to see changes, then you should measure and repeat. But then there are also, so again, if we stick with vitamin D, there are some ways to automate this process. So there's an app called D-Minder. You can put in a measurement for your vitamin D. It knows it measures where you are from a latitude and longitude standpoint. So it knows, and you put in some details about your complexion and how you respond to sun exposure. And then it gives you an estimate, how much time do you need to spend out in the daylight, in the sunlight, where you are to achieve a certain level of vitamin D. So you can do some, and there's a lot of data, particularly behind vitamin D, that you can follow. So you don't necessarily have to be going and getting your blood tested every week. There are some processes to sort of help you figure this out.
Geez, there's a lot of things coming out there. When I had Dr. Dan Plews on the other week, and, heart rate variability wasn't even a thing we talked about when I was an athlete in the 90s and early noughties. And obviously now it's become a big thing. He said, no, Greg, there's an app now. You can just test it, with the light from the camera. I don't know how accurate it is.
HRV for training is probably the one that I think...
HRV for training. Okay, and then you got D-Minder, which is like... I'll put these all in the show notes for everyone, because I think this is all fantastic. All of these things now are at our fingertips, and that's okay. Let me ask you this then: is there a place for these genetic DNA companies? I mean, off the top of my head, is it 23andMe and a number of others? Is there a place for them, or are they not there yet? Are you like? I'm encouraged that people are trying. Right, they're looking into it. I think what we're saying is they're coming at from then. When you get your report, you're not getting the full results in the sense of, like you said, the variabilities in the tests and exactly what it all means. We're not. Do you think there's a place for it all?
Yeah, so I think that there will be. There's certainly, I've seen some quite compelling data from a company. It's based in the UK, and I think they have some people in Italy, called Alelica, which is building polygenic risk scores for things like cardiovascular disease. It's based on their own panel. You can't do it with sort of like a simplistic 23andMe, but it won't be particularly expensive once it's available. And you can really stratify. It looks like you can really stratify people's risk of cardiovascular disease based on their genetics. And there's more and more of this stuff coming out. So particularly for cardiovascular disease, but there may also be some, could potentially be useful for things like Alzheimer's disease, maybe some other things, maybe some cancers. And so these things drive a relatively small proportion of your overall risk. To be honest, like the big driving factors are still these lifestyle factors that we talked about. But within a given group of people with a given sort of fixed lifestyle, set of lifestyle factors, then your genetics will sort of stratify you in terms of risk to a certain extent. So I think once we have very large data sets based on, probably it's going to end up being whole genome sequencing, rather than just like all these individual single nucleotide polymorphisms. And once we have that data, and we also have large population outcome data, which should include some risk factors, lifestyle, some blood testing, so some actual phenotype testing, like how does this person look, what are they exposed to, how do they look currently, then I think we'll figure this out. It's a big data science problem. And I think there is absolutely a place for knowing your own personal genetics, but I think that the way that the vast majority of current direct-to-consumer companies do it is not grounded in the current science. So it's definitely something that so when I've seen people do it well, and these things aren't commercially available yet, I think there is potential power there, but mainly because it will hopefully drive people to improve the things that are going to be their biggest levers, which again are going to be nutrition, sleep, movement, body composition, all that kind of stuff. Maybe some of their environmental exposures. So if we use it in order to help people pull the levers that we know are important, then I think that's great. The potential downside of that is that so far, when we've looked at data from genetic testing and said, hey, here's a gene, it puts you at risk of X, you need to do Y, people don't do it. So for the vast majority of people on a population level, just telling them that they're at increased risk because of their genetics does not drive behavior change, which is the thing that you actually want, right? No. So for you, Greg, if you're, or Laura, if you're data driven and so that type A personality that comes with, executives and athletes and those kind of groups, they will, you'll tell them, hey, you need to do this, and they'll just do it. But the majority of people are not like that, and just giving them more information about themselves does not drive behavior change. So yes, this data is potentially useful. I think most current solutions aren't very good at all. They will come eventually, but then the real problem is how you then use that to improve the health of the person in front of you. And that's a very different scenario, and more information is not going to be the key factor there.
Well, I think you've touched on something there. Is like we keep getting more and more information, more and more data, and it's trying to just see through it all what's truly important and what can we work on first, and prioritizing what really matters. and I think that's where someone like yourself, I've used you as a sounding board for a few years now, and it's been great to kind of go, well, what do I need to really prioritize? And it's nice to be able to have someone like you run that by. Let's move on to lifestyle factors, as you mentioned, and let's start with sleep and circadian rhythms. Firstly, how does circadian rhythm work? What is that?
That's a good question. So,
boom, straight into it. What are we doing?
So circadian comes from circadian, which means roughly a day in Latin. And so it's basically this cycle that most organisms are on this planet, and it's because there's the predictable 24-hour cycle of the sun rising and the sun setting. And so being exposed to light during the day and then darkness at night. And probably at this point, either directly or indirectly because of other genes and proteins that they interact with, most of the processes in the body run on a circadian rhythm, right? They are set, the biology is set in tune with this daily rhythm. And you can think about very obvious examples like melatonin, which is the main hormone associated with sleep. It's going to increase as it starts to get dark. It's going to peak sort of early in the night, and then it's going to decrease until you wake up in the morning. And then at the same time as melatonin is coming down, then cortisol is coming up, and cortisol peaks sort of early in the morning and then comes down during the day. So they have kind of a reciprocal relationship. But then with that, melatonin also influences insulin and how you handle different foods. And, at different times of day, your liver has different proteins and enzymes being made to sort of deal differently with, the food that you eat. And, so most, and then it continues, up and down the brain, and most of the organs that they have what we call clocks. So they are set to this time. There's a central clock, which is largely driven by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, and there's the peripheral clocks, and each tissue essentially has its own that's timed partly by the central clock, but then also by peripheral, or things that come in and, help set that. So the liver clock is more likely to respond to the food that you eat, because that's obviously the big kind of circadian thing that the liver is directly involved in, like the first processing of. So basically, every important part of your biology, and multiple hormones, testosterone and everything we've talked about, they have a daily rhythm. And this is kind of in order to align us with this natural clock, or exposure from the sun. And so during the day, we're in more of a kind of an active state, actually physically doing things, and then at night a lot of the repair processes start to happen. And when we disrupt these clocks, or we try to do the things that we're not supposed to be doing at the times when we're not supposed to be doing them. So if you're eating late at night when melatonin is high, that's associated with much higher blood sugar and metabolic dysregulation, because melatonin inhibits insulin signaling.
Wow.
So, and then equally, there's some interesting data on light exposure at night and skin cancers, or not being able to, recover and repair at night when it's dark, because you're still getting this signal that you should be awake, so you never get a chance to repair. So, everything we've talked about essentially is, something happens and then you have time to repair from it. And this happens on a daily cycle as well. And when things get mismatched, we think we know that shift workers or people who, don't sleep as much, or, whatever. So, they're potentially both connected and disconnected problems. So there's sleep restriction or sleep deprivation, which has its own set of problems, but it's going to be partially tied to, doing things, being awake, outside of normal circadian cycles. But people who do shift work or swing shifts, they have an increased risk of most of the chronic diseases that we've talked about. Certain cancers, obesity.
It all comes back, doesn't it? It's like this not turning off the stress.
Yeah.
It's like we need to find times to recover.
And for best outcomes, it needs to be time. During the day, you should be exposed to stress and stressors, and then at night you shouldn't be, and you should be asleep, and it's dark, and then all the sweepers come out and start clearing stuff up. And if you don't give yourself a chance to do that, and it happens one day or 2 days in a row, it's no big deal. But this stuff happens chronically over years and decades, then the damage really starts to accumulate.
So, you mentioned a few things there. When we say what can disrupt circadian rhythm, obviously the obvious things, one are, as you mentioned, shift work and those kinds of things. And I'd assume obviously jet lag, but can we do it through nutrition, like eating, like you sort of, can you eat, if you eat too much protein in the morning or too much, depending on the individual, is there a time and place for the amount of carbs or protein that your body prefers?
Yeah, so it's kind of roughly thought that the body is more insulin sensitive in the morning, and probably starting or sort of morning to lunchtime. And probably the lowest glucose responses to a given meal happen if you have that meal or those carbohydrates around lunchtime. And probably starting maybe 1 or 2 hours after you wake up, because when you wake up, cortisol and potentially melatonin are still elevated, so that can result in bigger sort of fluxes of blood sugar. So if you're going to get really technical about it, then like you might start with a more protein-based meal in the morning, and then have most of your carbohydrates around lunch, and then sort of get a mix but not a particularly large dinner. So most people think that you might do better if you shift more of your calories earlier in the day, particularly if you have metabolic disease. That being said, the magnitude of the effect is very small. So it may be better to do that, but is it that much better that everybody should be worrying about doing that? And I don't think the data suggests that
it's more information, mate. It's too much information now.
Yeah, and so at this point, right, it's interesting to me because I have an interest in circadian biology. I have an interest in metabolic health. Do I think that you need to have a protein-rich breakfast, have all your carbs at lunch, and then have a small dinner, not too close to bedtime? So I think not having a dinner too close to bedtime does help with sleep quality. So I do often recommend that. But I don't worry too much about macronutrient distribution during the day, because I think there are much bigger levers to pull, such as diet quality and total caloric intake and all that kind of stuff. So yes, there is potentially a better placing for like calories and macronutrients through the day, but I think the magnitude of the effect is so small that there are probably going to be much other more important things that you should worry about.
I've got something for you. Laura and I, again, we're talking about this over breakfast, as we do. And we were talking about, how we all mix our foods up a lot, in society these days. You should different types of meats every night, or, if you're a meat eater, different types of colored vegetables and, having all these mixed foods. And yet when we look at ancestral health, you and I go out hunting and we kill a buffalo, and we're pretty proud of ourselves, and we skin it, and we're nice and warm because we've got big buffalo fur. But now we go, okay, we've got all this meat. So we're just going to eat buffalo for the next week until it goes really nasty.
Yeah.
And then we probably won't eat buffalo again for quite a while because we have to, go out and get it. If we look at our basic ancestral health, is that how we should be approaching a little bit more of our diet these days, in terms of doing I don't know, I'm just brainstorming here, cycling through something?
So on that scale, I'm really not sure. So I think that's true. I think that is exactly what happens is you get what you can get, and then that's the thing that you eat, and that could be for a day or several days, depending on the supply. And going out to pick a few raw leaves to make yourself a nice salad to go with your buffalo, like that just didn't happen. Like it is, it's worth bearing in mind that like there's almost no sort of hunter-gatherer tribe that eats raw leaves, right? If they saw a Western salad, they'd be like, well, like, what is this? Why would you even eat that? And so I digress. But
no, I want to actually touch on that a little bit more. I've been saying salad is rabbit food for years, and Laura's been making me eat it. So we're going to go into that a bit more.
Yeah, okay. So I think like on a day-to-day basis, I really wouldn't worry about that. And there's no evidence, like I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that you need to worry about that. Like one day, so you're basically just going to eat steak for 3 days, and then it's going to be like, well, the buffalo disappeared, so I'm going to have to scrounge around for a few nuts and berries for a couple of days before I get more steak. You could do that, but I don't. You probably don't need to. However, I think it is interesting to think about. Well. So first of all, you kind of touched on it earlier that we don't really have seasons anymore, right? You're just inside. Other than when you like go and get in your car and drive to work and back, it's air conditioning during the summer and it's central heating in the winter, and you don't really get this kind of. And then it's also, there's electric lighting. So you don't get much more darkness in the winter as we would in more northern latitudes, and more sunshine and light exposure in the summer. That doesn't really happen anymore. But if that did happen, then, what would have happened? So say you live in a temperate, more northern or southern climate that has full seasons. During the winter, you're probably going to be relying on more animal foods, less carbohydrates, certainly, few starchy carbohydrates, no fruit. So you're probably going to spend some time, well, A, being hungrier, and B, more time being in ketosis, having more of your food coming from maybe protein and fats. And during that period of time, you'll probably lose weight over like the winter. And then in the summer, you would, sunlight promotes the ripening of fruits on the trees and all those kinds of things. And then we would probably eat as many of those things as we could possibly get our hands on. So we would get fatter over the summer just because there's more calories available. And we'll get as much as we can get our grubby hands on. And then you'll lose that excess weight over the winter, which is the exact opposite of what most people do, right? You get fat in the winter and then you slim down for beach season. So I think there's potentially something to that. And that signal is probably going to be stronger in people who, are from northern, more northern latitudes. So maybe somebody like myself, should I be in ketosis during the winter and then eat a lot of berries in the summer, which is probably what was available to my ancestors? Is that going to be better for me? Equally, I don't have these massive swings in daylight. In Iceland, it's dark all night in the winter and light literally all, 24 hours a day in the middle of the summer. So I don't have those same environmental inputs anymore. So I think it's interesting. There's a possibility that that's something, another sort of signal that our physiology is expecting that it isn't getting anymore. Whether that matters, I don't really know. But it's a great question. It's something I've thought about a lot, but I don't really know what the answer is.
Yeah, that's just, with my wife, Laura, who, that's just a typical morning breakfast conversation for us. And I'm always the cynical guy throwing bombs in going, well, how about, whatever, and I'm always coming up with these, well, that doesn't make sense. But we do have a bit of fun with it. Let's carry on with a little bit more with the nutrition, because for the endurance athletes that are listening, we've often discussed that you feel like perhaps we're not fueling enough. Mm-hmm. Tell me your thoughts a little bit on that.
Yeah. So I guess this stems from the largest single group of athletes that I've worked with, which tended to be endurance athletes, and also tended to come from a low carb sphere. We'll put it that way. And so when you're training, and so lots of triathletes, runners, obstacle course racers, those kinds of groups. And when you're training 20 plus hours a week and you are eating particularly a low carbohydrate diet, it's basically impossible to eat enough food, or almost impossible to eat enough food. And you certainly have to overcome a lack of hunger signaling. And so we certainly see in some people, particularly high volume endurance athletes who eat a low carb diet, they're just not hungry enough to eat all the food that they need to eat. And actually, if you add back a bit of carbohydrate, they get some of their hunger back. And so what I saw very frequently was just people who couldn't recover, were tired all the time, brain fog or whatever you want to call it, the multiple different symptoms, often lots of gut symptoms. And their hormones are all in the tank, testosterone low, thyroid signaling turned down. And it's just because they're not eating enough food. So there's definitely a point where if you're you're in the upper echelons of athletic performance, particularly endurance athletic performance, and you're training, 20 plus hours a week, you need to work really hard to eat enough food. Now, the downside of that, I think, is that when you look, again, if you look at some of the research on modern hunter-gatherers, because we have data on those, and compare them to westernized humans, it seems like the amount of energy expenditure that the human body is used to is somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day, and that counts for intakes as well. So when you look at, so they've looked at the Hadza hunter-gatherers. It's a sort of a very well-defined African hunter-gatherer group or groups. They basically limit their caloric, even though they're walking all day, moving, hunting, foraging, they basically limit their caloric output at something like up to maybe 3,000, 3,200 calories a day, which is the same as westernized humans. And it's interesting because we used to think that, well, westernized humans don't move as much, therefore we don't burn as many calories, and that's why we get fat. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So Herman Ponce is the person who's best known for this work, and there's a paper called the additive versus the constrained models of energy expenditure. And basically what it says is that the more movement you do, the the less movement, subconscious movement, you do the rest of the time. So if you spend all your day moving, then you will subconsciously conserve energy the rest of the time. So the difference in terms of energy expenditure that you can create without sort of turning down your spontaneous movement, non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, the rest of the time is probably around 200 calories a day. It's not that much, because there's this auto-regulated system that, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 calories, depending on, body size and sex and that kind of stuff. That's where that's what your body's used to in terms of output, but then also in terms of input. So the reason why I'm talking about all of this is because if you're a 6,000 calorie a day athlete, that puts an incredible stress on the GI system, and on the body in general, because that's twice as many calories as maybe it's used to, or can easily deal with over time. And so I think there's a potential trade-off here, and this could be so there's multiple reasons why GI symptoms are incredibly common in endurance athletes. I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this have experienced them at some point, because as the length and intensity of exercise increases, the likelihood that you get GI symptoms increases. And then by the time you get into like Ironman or ultramarathon, basically you're guaranteed to get some kind of gastrointestinal symptom almost. And so part of it, I think, is is the effects of exercise on the gut, but then it's also just like you have to, to survive that volume of training, you have to put so much fuel through the system, which creates a stress on the gut in its own right. And if you're not absorbing it, which does happen because of blood perfusion changes to the gut during exercise, then you have these undigested foods that end up in the gut, and then that can change your gut microbiota, that can cause bloating and diarrhea and all these other kinds of things. So I think it's just interesting to me that there's a potential trade-off between like what is the body used to and capable of dealing with from a caloric intake perspective. Obviously you need enough to maintain performance, but there may be a trade-off in terms of like are there any long-term ramifications of this? And it's a possibility, because those levels and intensities of exercise are not quote unquote ancestral. They're not something that we would normally have been exposed to. So it's a novel modern stressor, and that I think that's sort of explains some of the side effects that we end up seeing in some athletes.
That's fascinating, all of that, because it's kind of it's very unnatural, isn't it? I mean, from what you're saying, I mean, if we're meant to be living at that 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day, and I'm sure there's a real efficiency quota there. I mean, I know that, when we were training full time, I could do my 20-mile runs and back it up with a swim, and my diet wasn't any different than basically what I'm eating now. Yeah. Because I was just extremely efficient. Yeah. And that efficiency just came that I wasn't eating much more than 3,000 calories a day. And I was training, like you said, that 20, 25 hours a week. Now, if I'm somebody that's going from nothing to that, then that's going to be a lot of stress on the body. But I think I did it for 20, 30 years, and the body got more and more efficient, that it kind of did go back to that number that you're talking about in terms of a caloric intake, but I was efficient at doing it.
And that's probably one of the hallmarks of what is required. So I think there are multiple things that essentially are physiologically required to perform at the level that you did for the period of time that you did, and probably some kind of efficiency there is one of them, as well as being somebody who can respond to, adapt to, and recover from the types of training that you had to do to achieve those levels of performance. And then most people just can't do that.
No, and it was funny, but I didn't spend a lot of time doing the longer stuff. I focused on the shorter stuff. But the hours of training in a week were very much the same. And my good friend Craig Alexander, Crowy, 3-time Ironman world champion, everything else. And when I was kind of looking at doing some of the longer, even just the half Ironmans, I said, oh, well, what do I need for calories? I just kept go on long runs together. What do I need to do for this in the race? He goes, Greg, just take a gel at like 12K in the run, you'll be fine. And I do a bit of salt tablets in my water bottle. So I did that, and boy, did I blew to pieces. My body needed more, right? Yeah. But he'd become so efficient. He'd been doing them his whole career that for him, taking a gel at around 3 hours into a 3 hour 45 race, he was pretty much set. Yeah. He didn't need any calories. And so it was interesting trying to learn from some of these guys that had trained themselves to become so efficient. Maybe he was even genetically something there that the rest of us didn't have. It was kind of like, hang on, let's not listen to these guys too much. I don't mean to insult Growy because he's obviously learned a lot along his way, but it was funny when he did tell me that because I totally got hammered.
Yeah, sometimes the most talented athletes aren't the best coaches because they're like, well, it's just easy. You just do this, and then
and I'm going to be careful because I know Craig does have his own coaching, and I think he's learned a hell of a lot actually. When I did have him on the show, and I know Dave Scott also the same. They've all learned incredible amounts, so they are very smart. But it was funny, and maybe he was just doing it because we ended up racing each other a few times. Maybe it's just
maybe he's trying to sabotage you. so there's actually there's a couple of things that come from that just as I think about it, and so there's some interesting data on. So obviously there's the fueling side, but then there's also the dehydration, the weight loss side, and there's some really interesting data that Tim Noakes published. I mean, it's like 20 years ago now, looking at ultra marathon, either triathlon or ultra marathon, like the Comrades Marathon in South Africa, data. The people who finished fastest were the people who lost the most weight. Like they were 10 or even 20% dehydrated. They've lost that much body weight by the end. So like they just have this capacity to become hugely dehydrated and just they don't need to stop for water. They just sort of just keep going. And there's like some physiological capacity to deal with that. So there's a fueling side, there's the efficiency side, there's the sort of like the dehydration weight loss side. And if you have like this capacity to deal with that seems to predict performance, particularly in some of those longer races. But so I remember I did an ultra marathon in the UK, the Atlantic Coast Challenge. So it was 3 marathons in 3 days along. So like the coast in Cornwall, so up and down cliffs and over beaches and all that kind of stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
And I eventually came fourth, but the last day there was sort of like the top 3 or 4 of us were sort of ran together the first bit, and then in the end, like these were much better marathon runners than me, had much faster road times than me, and they sort of like disappeared into the distance in the last third of the race maybe. But I remember going through all the different feed stations, and it would often be on this like rocky outcrop in the middle of nowhere where somebody would rock up with like a box full of penguins and like some like bottles of water or something. And
what's a penguin? Hang on.
Oh wait,
what?
like it's like a chocolate. They don't have penguins in Australia or in the US, so it's basically like 2 layers.
You're gonna have to describe that.
It's 2 layers of chocolate biscuit with like a chocolate cream in the middle and then chocolate on the outside.
Oh, lovely.
It's a penguin. Yeah. But my personal preference was a Snickers bar. But okay. so what I remember is that we'd get to these feed stations, and they were maybe every 5 or 6 miles or so. And so like the guys I was running with, who again were much better road marathon runners than me, but my rowing legs sort of helped me get up and down the cliff sides. I think that's what kind of helped me keep up with them. Like they would just blow through the feed station, like just no need for it. Whereas I would like get 2 Snickers bars and I'd like be double fisting them as I climbed the next hill, like one in each hand. And so I think there's definitely that efficiency standpoint certainly probably played a big role there, because I was not efficient, but I could sort of blast my sort of all strength and brute strength and ignorance was pretty much my my motto when I was an athlete competitively. So yeah, that kind of stood me at least partially in good stead.
It is fascinating, though, isn't it, when we talk about the efficiency side of it? Because I always encourage athletes that are getting into the sport of triathlon, and it's a very addictive a sport, or any endurance sport. You get addictive, and you want to try and do better than your last. But there tends to be these days with, somebody will do a local little triathlon, and then the next thing they've entered an Ironman, 6 months away, and I'm going to do an Ironman, and that rapid step up is really starts to become metabolically unhealthy. I think it's when you like you said, what it does to the body and the systems within your body, the biology is just not used to that. Yeah. That maybe it is something that we all need to just take a little bit more seriously. Look, if you want to do an Ironman, it's okay to have a 4 to 5 year kind of plan. Yeah. Build gradually to it, and that's maybe what we should be trying to encourage people to do a little bit more. I don't know. It's a fascinating area, and I love what you talked about with the Africans and how they've studied how they've become just so efficient at that, 2,000 to 3,000 calories. That's now going to stick with me. Well, I want to finish with one last thing, and that's us as humans and the importance of being social. with each other and that effect on our metabolic health overall. This has been a fascinating past year where we had, COVID and lockdowns and people in isolation. What are your thoughts on what we should be doing a little bit more for our health in terms of being the social connections?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and there have been some or multiple studies looking at what we would call social isolation and health outcomes. And social isolation is one of the biggest individual risk factors or predictors of all-cause mortality.
Wow.
And obviously becomes more important as you get older, as well as becoming more prevalent as people get older. And so there's some, I remember one analysis that said, it's impossible to directly quantify these things, so take it with a pinch of salt. But they basically said that being socially isolated was as bad for your longevity as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That was the magnitude of the effect. And so
wow.
Who knows if that's actually true, but the fact that it was even close for them to make that comparison, I think is quite compelling. And so pretty much every disease that you care to mention is the risk, again, all those things we talked about, is the risk is increased with social isolation. And there could be some reverse causality there, that as you become sicker, you become more socially isolated. So, that kind of, they don't necessarily, one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. They are connected in both directions. But certainly very important for both mental and physical health. And a friend of mine I was talking to recently, Mark Schneider, he runs a program called Trauma-Informed Weightlifting, uses weightlifting to sort of improve both physical and mental health after trauma. We were talking a little bit about this, and he mentioned that he didn't think that COVID had increased social isolation. It had just uncovered all the social isolation that currently exists in the US and other countries. And I think to a certain extent, that's absolutely correct. We are increasingly isolated as we live in, single homes, single flats, as we get old, maybe fewer people live in a large family unit. They have fewer, actual physical friends that they see, even before the pandemic took hold. And the interest, so again, I think that's just kind of baked into our modern society, and then again is associated with those downstream risks. And early on in the pandemic, you and I had this debate about whether whether this isolation, and so it was called social distancing, but it didn't need to be social distancing. It was more like physical distancing, right? You didn't have to not communicate with others, although if you did.
I was going to ask you just now, is it, when you talk about social connection, is it okay to do it through FaceTime and that, or is there meant to be a physical?
Yeah,
are we meant to be in each other's presence a little bit more?
Yeah, so both, I think, and so one way. So at least early on in the pandemic, there were some studies that suggested that actually people hadn't become or didn't feel as isolated and didn't have as much of an effect on their mental health because of the pandemic than we thought they would. And some of the reasons for that were that there was this kind of blitz mentality, like we're all in this together, which kind of gives us this sort of boost. But then also people were, actually more likely to reach out to friends and family, be it via FaceTime or Zoom or Skype or whatever, because that was being encouraged, and because that, it was easier. They were home all the time. So actually those created a psychological buffer. We actually increased social connection to a certain point, even though the way that we did it changed. And that seemed to help, at least in the beginning, although I think longer term, those benefits seem to have decreased, and actually now we're starting to see a lot more sort of reports of the negative mental health effects of the pandemic, and they are also tied to the economic effects and all those other things that you talked about. So I think you can certainly get some benefit from remote connection, but then there's also like a physical oxytocin neurotransmitter, feel-good chemical release of physically touching, being in the same place as others, and physically interacting with them. So I think both are important. But that you can certainly achieve at least part of it and good chunks of it through remote connection.
I think the remote connection, as you put it, is, I don't know about everybody else, but I kind of felt, okay, I'm always been a planner, and I like to know where I'm going, and we're going back to Australia, we're going to the US, we're going to visit family. And all of a sudden, it was like, okay, you can't plan anymore, and you just have to be everybody, like you said, we're all in this together, just stay put. And to some degree, it was like, okay, just be present every day with what I have and make an effort then to, to be social via, the FaceTime or Zoom or whatever, and get out in the world. But I can't do any more than that. So now I can't, there's no guilt associated with not seeing family or friends. Yeah. It's like, I can only do what I can do. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to get worked up about it. Yeah. I can't do anymore. And so you kind of get to that acceptance level pretty quickly. I think at first it was like, oh no, we can't travel, whatever. But then you kind of go, okay, once I get to acceptance, I actually feel quite comfortable. And it's like, okay, I'm going to get through today. And, I've said numerous times on this show, just being grateful for what I have. Mm. Suddenly you can change that mindset. And I do think there is this kind of like, okay, when are we all going to come out of this now? I wouldn't mind, Australia opening their doors and letting us come home. But I also get it. And you start to get, okay, this is getting old, but patience is a virtue, hang in there. And so I get what you're saying. And like you said, we did touch on a while ago, we were kind of debating how people are dealing with it. And I think it's affected, like you said, there's people are out of work or whatever. There's a lot of other things involved that, and I think we're going to see, over this next 12 months, we're still going to see a fair bit of that. And a little bit of that's going to be just looking out for each other a fair bit, as a society coming out, as they did out of sort of the wars and things of the past. It's kind of going, okay, how do we serve each other and help each other? And in doing so, by serving each other, I think we help our own health.
Yeah, and there's also some nice data on that. Where are you getting your pleasures from hedonic, self-centric pleasures versus eudaimonic, like helping others, something, contributing something bigger than yourself? That like has an effect on your immune system and on your health. And it's again because the way that you are placed within society does directly affect your physiology, and that's where you get some of the social isolation actually having direct physical effects. It changes your immune system, and So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And this is one of the potential downsides, my personal opinion, of the sort of general ethos in the US, which is very individualistic. Like, we're very internally and self-focused as a society, but there is a lot of benefit to be had from, going outwards and helping others and thinking about others above your own personal freedoms or preferences, because like sometimes you require the group, what benefits the group also then feeds back and benefits you eventually. So I think it's worth bearing those things in mind. And then actually sort of going back to what you mentioned earlier, and I think it's very relevant to everything we've talked about today, is that accepting that you have done what you can do and then not worrying about any more. That applies to pretty much everything. It applies to sleep and nutrition and movement. And I'm a big fan of saying that we should control the things that we can control, and then the things that we can't control, if we're able to worry about those less or not worry about them, then we've kind of found what's potentially optimal for us. Because there's always going to be things that you can improve, but there's going to be a point where you can't do anymore. And then creating worry about that is only going to result in negative health outcomes, because you can't fix it, but you're creating stress. So I think that attitude can certainly be applied to most of the areas that we've talked about today.
Mate, there's nothing I don't enjoy about these conversations. Your knowledge and just the way you talk, and I just... Mate, I think we're going to finish up there, but I really enjoy these conversations. I hope you're okay with coming back on them, because I feel like every time we get to chat, we kind of strip another bit off the onion, and we get a little deeper. And your knowledge, I know you hold back on me a little bit, because you don't get too scientific on me, which I really appreciate. But it is just fascinating, and I think as we come out of 2020 and into 2021 now, and there's just, we're going to be hitting there's going to be different things in society that are going to be hitting us, and I think we can always discuss those as well. But always love these conversations. So thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me again. It's been a huge pleasure. I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. That was Dr. Tommy Wood, and this is The Greg Bennett Show. Now, you can find the show notes, timestamps, coupon links, and everything else at bennettendurance.com/90. media. All right, stay on the line, mate. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot for listening to Be With Champions. If you've enjoyed the show, your support would truly be appreciated. You can visit the Be With Champions Patreon page, or you can subscribe with your podcast app of choice. Don't miss the next episode, so subscribe and be notified. For show notes, if you want to know more, please visit bennettendurance.com. I'm Phil Liggett, and on behalf of Greg Bennett, here's to the next time, and I hope you will join Greg again very soon.